The det no one asked for the station was called Third Light, and it had exactly 41 minutes of air left when the humans answered. Veltarasha counted the minutes the way her people always counted things that mattered, out loud in a whisper, so that the number itself became a kind of prayer. 41 minutes. She had already said goodbye to the 11 others in the reactor bay with her. She had already stopped being afraid of dying and started being afraid of the silence that would come after, the silence where nobody in the galaxy would ever know that Third Light had existed at all. Her people were called the Ashiel, and they were not a great power. They were not a small one either, not weak, not foolish, not cowardly. They were simply late. Every species the Ashiel had ever reached out to had already carved up the quiet corners of the spiral arm long before the Ashiel climbed out of their oceans and into the dark. By the time Ashiel ships began drifting past the borders of established space, there was nowhere left that wanted them, and nothing left that needed them. And so the great trade compacts and defense pacts of the galaxy simply filed the Ashiel under the heading of not yet relevant and moved on. Third Light was an Ashiel research station, orbiting a dead moon in a system nobody else had bothered to name. It had been struck by a rogue fragment of an old collapsed shipyard, debris thrown loose by a war fought 200 years before the Ashiel had even developed radio. The strike had cracked the reactor containment, and the containment was failing, and there was no Ashiel fleet close enough to reach them in time because the Ashiel did not have a fleet, not really. They had 6 ships, and none of them were warships, and none of them were within 11 days of Third Light. So Veltarasha had done what the station's protocols told her to do. She had broadcast a distress call on every open frequency the station's transmitter could reach, not really expecting an answer, because the Ashiel had learned over the slow, bitter years that distress calls from nobody species were rarely worth another empire's fuel. The answer came back in 11 minutes. It was in a language her translation matrix didn't recognize at first, rough and fast and strange, full of consonants that didn't belong together. The matrix took 9 seconds to resolve it into something she could understand, and when it did, the voice on the other end was already mid-sentence. Say again, Third Light, this is the long-range vessel Ohio Rules Registry Sol Federated Assembly. We are receiving your distress beacon. Please confirm survivor count and structural status. Over. Veltarasha stared at the console. Sol Federated Assembly. Humans. She knew the name the way everyone in the quiet corners of the galaxy knew the name, as a rumor, as a punchline, as a species that had appeared out of nowhere 4 decades ago with no elders to guide them and no patience to be guided, and had spent every year since then doing something that made the older powers nervous in a way they couldn't quite articulate. Humans didn't have a reputation for cruelty. They had a reputation for a kind of recklessness that nobody could predict and nobody could plan around, and in a galaxy built entirely on the careful mathematics of who owed what to whom, unpredictability was its own kind of danger. She had never expected to hear a human voice. She had certainly never expected one to be the first to answer. "This is Third Light," she said, and her voice cracked on the second word, and she let it crack, because there was no one left to perform calm for. 12 survivors, reactor containment breach. We have. She looked at the number on the wall display, watched it change even as she spoke. 39 minutes of breathable air. We do not have evacuation craft. We do not have a fleet in range. We are Ashiel. I don't know if that matters to you. There was a pause, not long, just long enough that she wondered if the connection had failed. "Ma'am," the voice said, and something in the tone had changed, gone flatter and harder. "It doesn't matter to us even a little bit. We are 8 minutes out at our current burn. We are increasing that burn right now. Sit tight. 8 minutes." She looked at the trajectory the matrix was already calculating from the ship's transponder data, cross-referenced against the ship's stated position, and the number didn't make sense because no vessel of that mass class should have been able to close that kind of distance in 8 minutes without the number updated. The Ohio Rules was no longer decelerating for a standard rendezvous approach. It was accelerating toward them at a rate that made the reactor readings on her own dying station look conservative by comparison. "You are burning at 14 gravities," she said, because she needed to say it out loud to believe it, the way her people said the things that mattered. "Your inertial dampeners cannot compensate for that." Our crew signed up knowing the dampeners have a hard ceiling," the voice said. "And we've got about 4 seconds of slack on it before things get uncomfortable in here, and we've decided uncomfortable is an acceptable trade for 8 minutes instead of 20. Ma'am, I need you to move your people to the section of the station closest to Docking Bay 2 if it still exists, and I need you to do it now, because we are not slowing down until we're on top of you, and when we get there we are not going to have time to be polite about the docking procedure." Veltarasha found herself moving before she finished processing the instruction, keying the intercom, relaying the order to the reactor bay, her voice steadier now than it had been in an hour, steady with something she hadn't let herself feel since the first alarm sounded. Not hope exactly. Hope required believing the universe cared whether the Ashiel lived or died, and the universe had given her no reason to believe that. This was something else. This was the specific, narrow, physical fact that somewhere out in the dark, an alien ship full of alien people was tearing its own engines apart to reach 12 strangers it owed nothing to. She thought about the compacts. She thought about the treaties the great powers signed with each other, full of careful clauses about response times and acceptable losses and the cold arithmetic of which species were worth the fuel to save. She had grown up understanding that arithmetic. Every Ashiel child did. You learned it the way you learned to breathe recycled air, not because anyone taught it to you directly, but because it was simply the shape of the world, and Third Light's 41 minutes had been the proof of it. One more time, right on schedule. The humans hadn't run the arithmetic, or they had and had thrown it out a window at 14 gravities, 22 minutes of air left when the Ohio rules came into visual range. And Veltarasha understood, looking at it, why the burn had sounded like madness. It was not a warship. It was not built for this. It was a long-haul survey vessel, blunt and unlovely, its hull scorched along one flank from what she would later learn was atmospheric skip braking through a gas giant's upper layer to shave time off an earlier leg of its journey, because apparently that was simply how this species traveled when it was in a hurry. It came in hot, far too hot, and for one long, terrible second she was certain it was going to plow straight through Third Light's hull and finish what the shipyard debris had started. Then its engines flared retrograde, a burn so hard and so sudden that the light of it washed out her external cameras white, and the ship that should not have been able to stop, stopped, close enough that she could see individual hull plates through the observation port, close enough that the station's proximity alarms screamed in a register she'd never heard them use before. "Docking Bay 2, prepping mag clamps now," said the voice, rougher now, strained, a human voice that had just spent 8 minutes being crushed by forces its body was never meant to survive and was already moving on to the next problem. "Get your people to the airlock. We've got a hard seal in 90 seconds, and I want to be honest with you, ma'am, our ship doesn't have room for 12 extra bodies in comfort, but it's got room for 12 extra bodies, and honestly that's the only number that matters today." She did not remember the walk to Docking Bay 2. She remembered the airlock cycling, the hiss of unfamiliar atmosphere mixing with the last of theirs, and she remembered the human crew on the other side, 5 of them, out of a full complement that couldn't have been more than 15, reaching through the gap before the doors had even fully opened, hauling her people through by whatever grip they could get, not gently, not with ceremony, just fast, because fast was the only kindness that mattered in that particular minute. The one who had spoken to her over the comm was younger than she expected and smaller, and there was blood at the corner of his mouth from the burn, a thin dark line he hadn't bothered to wipe away, and he was already turning to the next survivor before she'd fully cleared the threshold. 13 minutes on your air," he said to no one in particular, to all of them at once, "which means it's already somebody else's problem because you're on our air now." Sit down, strap in, we are leaving this system the second the last of you is through that door, and it's going to be rough, so grab whatever's bolted down. She strapped in. She watched through a viewport not built for passengers, as third light fell away behind them, its reactor finally breaching in a bloom of white that the ship's sensors flagged 20 seconds after they were already clear of the blast radius. 20 seconds that had been the entire margin between rescue and epitaph. 20 seconds bought by a species that had thrown 14 gravities at a problem because 8 minutes felt too long to leave someone waiting. It was 3 days before she worked up the nerve to ask the question that had been sitting in her chest since the airlock. She found the young officer. His name, she had learned, was Danny Osai, and he held a rank she didn't fully understand, but that seemed to mean he was responsible for approximately everything on the ship at once, in a cramped galley that smelled of something bitter, and roasted that the humans called coffee, and drank in quantities that struck her as faintly alarming. "I want to understand," she said, choosing the words carefully, the way she chose words when she was afraid the answer would hurt. "Your assembly, your government, does it know you diverted a survey vessel at risk to your crew to rescue a species with no trade agreement, no defense pact, no formal relations with your people at all? Will there be a cost to you for this?" Danny Osai looked at her for a moment like the question genuinely hadn't occurred to him, and then he laughed not unkindly and rubbed a hand over his face. "There's gonna be paperwork," he said. "There's always paperwork. Somebody in an office somewhere is gonna ask me why I put 14 gravities of stress on a hull rated for 11, and I'm gonna tell them the truth, which is that there were people dying and I had the fuel to go get them, and that's—" He stopped, seemed to search for the right way to say it. "Ma'am, that's kind of the whole thing. That's the whole reason we're out here." There was no debt, she pressed. No treaty obligation, no trade value in the Ashiel. By every calculation the rest of this galaxy uses, we were not worth the fuel. Something shifted in his face then, something that looked almost like anger, though she would learn over the following weeks that it wasn't anger at her. It was older than that and tireder. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We've run into that math before. Every species we've met out here has some version of it, some ledger where you tally up who's useful and who isn't, who's got something to trade and who's just gonna cost you fuel and time and risk for nothing in return. And look, I get it. Resources aren't infinite. Nobody's got a magic answer for that. But somewhere along the way, a lot of folks out here decided that the ledger was the whole story. That if the math didn't pencil out, you just didn't go. You logged the distress call, you filed the report, and you let the clock run out and you called that responsible." He turned his mug in his hands, not drinking from it, just holding it. "We had our own dark stretch of history where we ran that math on each other," he said. "Different groups of us, different nations, deciding some lives were worth the cost of saving and some weren't. Took us a long, ugly time to mostly stop doing that to our own kind. So when we got out here and found out the whole galaxy runs on that same ledger, just scaled up to a few hundred species instead of a few hundred countries," he shook his head. "We looked at that and we looked at each other, and pretty much everybody agreed, no, not doing that, not again. If somebody's dying and we've got the fuel, we go, we figure out the paperwork after, even if it costs you the ship. Especially then," he said, and he said it so simply, so completely without performance that she understood he wasn't posturing for her benefit. It was simply flatly the truest thing he knew. "A ship's a thing we can build more of. What we can't get back is the 12 of you if we sit here doing math instead of moving. That's not a hard trade for us. I know it looks like recklessness from outside, maybe it is. But it's a recklessness we picked on purpose, with our eyes open, because the alternative was becoming the kind of people who let the ledger decide who gets to live." Veltarasha sat with that for a long time after he left the galley. She thought about the great powers and their careful compacts, the ones that had never once glanced sideways at the Ashiel in all the years her people had been drifting through the dark corners of the galaxy, unwanted, unweighed, unworthy of the fuel. She thought about how thoroughly she had absorbed that verdict, how she had genuinely believed in the reactor bay, counting down her 41 minutes, that the silence afterward would simply be the correct and expected outcome of being a species that nobody needed. She thought about 14 gravities and a hull rated for 11, and a boy with blood at the corner of his mouth who hadn't stopped moving until the last of her people was through the door. Word of third light spread slower than she expected and then faster than she could track. Ashiel elders, cautious by long habit, initially treated the rescue as an anomaly, a single crew's decision, not a policy, not something to build hope around. But then came the report of a human relief convoy that broke from a scheduled patrol route to answer a distress call from a mining collective 3 systems over, a species so minor that even the Ashiel had barely heard of them. Then came the story of a single human diplomatic shuttle that had, without authorization from anyone, rerouted itself to sit beside a crippled vessel from a species actively at war with a human ally, and stayed there, unarmed, simply so the crippled ship wouldn't die alone waiting for a rescue that its own side wasn't sending. The older powers began to talk about it in careful, uneasy terms. Beltarasha heard some of that talk secondhand, filtered through diplomatic channels the Ashiel were only just beginning to be included in. She understood now, specifically because the humans had started insisting on it, had started standing in rooms where the Ashiel had never been invited and saying, simply they're part of this conversation now, and daring anyone to explain why not. The unease, she came to understand, wasn't really about the rescues themselves. It was about what the rescues implied. A galaxy run on ledgers was, in its own cold way, predictable. You could calculate what any given power would do because you knew what they valued and you knew the price they'd pay for it. Humans had introduced a variable nobody could price, a species that had simply decided collectively and stubbornly that some things weren't for sale, weren't up for calculation, weren't going to be weighed against fuel costs and diplomatic risk. A species that would burn its own hull past the rated limit for people who had nothing to offer in return, not because it was strategic, but because the alternative was a version of themselves they'd already tried once and hated. That was the thing that unsettled the old powers most, she realized. Not human strength. Human strength could be measured, matched, planned around. It was human mercy that broke the model. Mercy with no ledger behind it, mercy extended on principle to species that couldn't repay it and would never be able to, mercy that made no sense within the only framework the galaxy had ever used to understand power. Beltarasha stayed aboard the Ohio Rules for 6 weeks while the Ashiel elders arranged transport home, and in that time she watched the crew with the close, careful attention of someone rebuilding, plank by plank, an entire understanding of how the universe worked. She watched Danny Osai get quietly, thoroughly reprimanded for the 14 gravity burn, watched him accept the reprimand without complaint, and watched him tell her afterward without a flicker of regret that he'd do it again tomorrow if the numbers were the same. She watched the crew argue, genuinely argue loudly over the coffee that smelled bitter and roasted, about whether the assembly was doing enough for species like the Ashiel, whether enough was even a number that could be reached, whether the whole framework of ledgers and treaties that governed the rest of the galaxy was something to work within or something to simply refuse. She had never seen a species argue about generosity as though generosity were a duty rather than a luxury, as though the only real question was how to do more of it, faster, better, for people who would never be able to pay it back. On the last night before her transport arrived, she stood with Danny Ose at the observation port, watching the slow wheel of unfamiliar stars, and she asked him the question she had been saving. "Why does it matter to you?" she said. "What happens to a species you'd never even heard of a year ago? What do the Ashiel mean to Sol Federated Assembly that you would spend your ship, your crew, your own blood to keep 12 of us alive?" He was quiet for a while before he answered, and when he did his voice was low and there was none of the easy humor in it that usually lived there. "You want the honest answer," he said. "It's that you don't mean anything to us yet, not in the way you're asking. We didn't know the Ashiel existed a year ago, you're right. We've got no treaty with you, no trade route, nothing on any ledger anywhere that says we owe you a thing." He turned to look at her and his eyes in the dim light of the observation deck were steady. But you were people and you were dying and we had the fuel to go get you. That's the whole equation. That's always been the whole equation for us. We're not out here doing the math on who's worth saving. We're out here trying to make sure nobody ever has to do that math again about anybody, ever, because we spent a long, ugly stretch of our own history doing exactly that math to each other, and we know exactly what it costs, and we decided we were done paying it. He looked back out at the stars. So no, he said, the Ashiel don't mean anything to us yet, give it time.